From 1964, the Beach Boys with Do You Remember, a nostalgic look back at the early days of rock and roll written by Brian Wilson and Mike Love. Interestingly, those early days of rock and roll were less than 10 years old when the Beach Boys recorded that song, proving that the group always had one eye on the past, even as they chugged forward. 50s rock and roll, the formative years of the Beach Boys, the nostalgia craze of the early 1970s, it's all on the menu today as we chat once again with editor of Endless Summer Quarterly magazine, David Beard. David, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
So the impetus for today's discussion sprang from your recent interview with Brian Wilson in the latest issue of ESQ. Is that correct?
Yeah, the spring 2020 edition. I was just trying to basically do a catch-up interview with Brian.
Mm-hmm.
Because the winter 2019 edition was a tribute to Nick Volusko. I wasn't able to get Brian prior to going to print with that edition.
Right.
So I wanted to talk to him about Nick a little bit. I wanted to talk to him about this recent Brian Wilson scholarship, and I talked to David Leaf and Brent Wilson, who's the documentarian for Brian Wilson, Long Promised Road. And this is kind of what I wanted to talk to you today about, was apparently during the Long Promised Road documentary, initially they were just interviewing Brian's band members, different people, peripherally in the Beach Boys world, who'd been around the music a long time. And then, of course, outside of that world, those influenced Bruce Springsteen, Elton John, etc. And they weren't really getting the level of insight from Brian that they were hoping. So they brought in Jason Fine from Rolling Stone magazine to be a part of the documentary. And basically, Brian and Jason go around together in a car from one location to another. And during that time, Brian really kind of opened up because he was really comfortable with Jason. And Brian started talking about his brothers a lot, which is kind of how Long Promised Road came up.
That's the title, sure.
Yeah, Brian kept bringing Carl's song up. And so they have re-recorded that with Blondie Chaplin, Brian, and then Jim James from the group My Morning Jacket. And I know Jim James was also interviewed, so I guess that's how that fell together. But Brian talked a lot about his brothers, so he was obviously dialing into something from his younger life, whether it's Carl and that song specifically.
Right.
He may also be thinking of the Surf's Up album. He, for all we know, he may also be thinking of 1971 and living in Bellagio. We don't specifically know. I've not seen any footage from the documentary yet, so I can't say what exactly.
And let me just jump in for a second for the audience that might be confused. This documentary, you haven't seen footage yet because this documentary is not out. It is going to be making the rounds, though, at festivals.
Right. It's kind of going into this fall that it's going to be kind of making the rounds. So, it's interesting because I think a lot of fans are going, why is it called Long Promised Road? That's a Carl song. But the reason is Brian kept talking about the song, like I said, to the point where he wanted to record it again, and they did. So I thought that was kind of interesting and kind of cool that Brian is still just as attached to that song. And it's a great song. So hard. So the thing that I started gravitating towards, based on my interview with Brian, was the Wilson brothers. And then when I started thinking about the Wilson brothers, I started thinking about the Wilson family. And when I started thinking about the Wilson family, I started thinking about how Edith and Buddy Wilson had eight children, and of those 8 children, Murray Wilson, who ended up being Brian, Dennis, and Carl's dad, and Emily Glee Wilson, who ended up being Mike Love's mother. And I ended up just thinking about family. And so in my editor's notes in this new edition, the spring 2020, I just talk about Brian and Mike growing up together as kids and what their life was like and how much they knew each other, because by the time they signed their contract, Brian and Mike had been around one another for almost 20 years. And you think about that. They spent the most time together outside of their homes. You know, they'd go to church together. They'd sing together. Not just at family get-togethers, because I think most Beach Boy fans who know anything about the Wilson and Love family get-together is always associated directly with Christmas. But it wasn't that way. It was always at the Love household, it was always Mike and Brian, and typically Mike's sister Maureen, because they were the three oldest out of the two families, and they spent a lot of time together.
Yeah, I remember a story in Jim Murphy's book, Becoming the Beach Boys. By the way, that book comes highly recommended by both of us, I would say, and I think it's a book that really sheds light on those very early years of the group. But in that book, Jim Murphy talks about Brian and Mike, well, having sleepovers, Brian going over to Mike's house and them sneaking out to sit in the family car in the driveway and listen to rock and roll on the radio all night long.
Yeah, they loved Everly Brothers. They loved Chuck Berry. I mean, you're thinking mid to late 50s. Elvis was coming on at the time. Bill Haley and the Comets, all the Buddy Holly, Jerry Lee Lewis, Carl Perkins. I don't know how much Carl Perkins had crossed over into contemporary radio.
Right.
Or he was just considered a country artist. But there was a handful of them that they were listening to just as the Beatles were listening to overseas. And Mike and Brian were the most impressionable. They loved doo-wop. They loved rhythm and blues. They loved kind of just about everything that was coming over the radio. And I think they both listened to them, as we know today, the way things developed in the group of the Beach Boys. I think Brian and Mike were probably listening to those songs differently in that, let's just say, Devoted to You, Brian was probably singing it with Mike, but at the same time, working out the vocal parts, while Mike was probably just singing and thinking, I like the way they use the words here, so I'm going to see if I can't lyrically do something similar. That's how they developed. Brian's the one who got a converted garage into a music room and ended up noodling around a bunch. And remember, growing up, you don't think, hey, let's form a band. I mean, some people do that at some point. But with Mike and Brian, it was never that. They weren't, let's form a band. They were just happy to be around one another and spend time together because they shared interests. And yeah, Brian would go over to Mike's and stay overnight because, A, he didn't have to deal with his dad that way, and Mike lived in a much bigger home.
Yes.
And so it all lent itself to that type of environment. And so whether it be going out and listening to in the driveway in the car or listening through a transistor radio up in Mike's room at night, that is a memory that Brian took with him throughout the Beach Boys' success, and it played itself out and developed into Mount Vernon and Fairway, which are the street intersection of where Mike's house was.
And for the audience that might not know what we're talking about, Mount Vernon and Fairway was an EP, almost like a children's record that was included with 1973's Holland album by the Beach Boys.
I cannot imagine what Mike's reaction must have been to the Mount Vernon and Fairway EP.
That's so interesting. That would be fascinating to find out what he thought of that.
Yeah, because on one hand, he's like, well, this can't go on the album.
Right.
Because this is more like a personal memento to me. This is this little personal EP memento. So that's the thing. When you listen to it from that perspective, he just emotionally reached back, and I could sit here and come up with 50 different reasons as to why I think maybe he wrote it. But the bottom line was the childhood that they forged together, that they had together, was that valuable to Brian. And it was also probably in some sense a tribute to his aunt and uncle and that family in general, and his, again, great memories of those days.
There it was. The music had to have...
WFDU FM.
That's us. We're back talking with David Beard, editor of Endless Summer Quarterly magazine, about the prehistory of the Beach Boys. And we just spoke about the Mount Vernon and Fairway EP, and now you wanted to jump ahead to another song that harkened back to an earlier time.
Well, fast forward, that was 72, 73. Fast forward 5 years, and Mike develops this song called Brian's Back. Teenage gambler sitting in a Rambler listening to the radio. Well, boom, there you are, Mike and Brian back in the driveway. And so those songs represent the Mount Vernon and Fairway, Fairy Tale and Mike's Brian's Back, those two songs are not coincidental. Those pieces of musical work are pure examples of their appreciation for each other regardless of everything that had come to pass. I mean, you got to figure by this 1973, a lot of things had come to pass, including the sale of Brian's music.
Sure.
The fact that Mike had not been properly credited on songwriting, and the culprit in both of those scenarios is Murray. And more crap happens, and by 78, when Brian's Back is recorded, all the guys are up at Santa Barbara. Brian, Carl, Al. I think Dennis was the only one who wasn't, and Bruce wasn't, because he wasn't in the band at that time. But Brian, Carl, and Al were. And I don't think Brian sang on Brian's Back, but he was up in the compound. Mike had a compound up in Santa Barbara, so they were all up there. And you can hear the Beach Boys singing on the song. So it's particularly Carl. So Brian's Back is not like a song that you can say, isn't it a great song or whatever. It's more about the intent. It's more about the cognitive connection that the two of them made in those early years of their lives, and how much to this day. And I mean, here we got Brian talking about Long Promised Drought and Carl. And Mike, if you sat down with him today and talked to him about Brian, he'd get choked up and teary. Good or bad, whatever that represents for Mike, whether it's nostalgia or regret or whatever it is, there's some serious long-term feelings and emotions that accompany those early years before they were ever Beach Boys or Kenny and the Cadets or whatever they wanted, Carl and the Passions or whatever they wanted to call themselves. It's no mistake that those songs were recorded and developed and put together. Brian's Back is Mike's way of saying, I need you. I need you. And it was more than I need you as the music leader. It was more than I need you to be the guy who writes the hit songs. I think that was Mike's. I don't think he would say, I love you and mean this much to me. But they all have the ability to express through song.
Right.
And I think that's exactly what that is.
Teenage gal.
And the Made in California box set from 2013 had the previously unreleased Why Don't They Let Us Fall in Love, which is a great doo-wop
yes,
song.
Yes.
It's bum, ba-doo, ba-doo, ba-dum, ba-doo, ba, and it's just so Mike and Brian. Some fans look back and look at their catalog and get into talking about it. They almost say like that they ended up as a touring jukebox or an oldies show. Most people don't understand how that happened. Right. They were trying to be progressive entertainers and went from Sunflower to Surf's Up, and were performing that material kind of in earnest with only Cars and Surf medley in their shows. So the big hits that they were most known for were little condensed segues that they'd shove together and then do these more introspective and artistic songs, and they were slowly but surely fewer and fewer people were coming to their shows. And so by 73, 74, they met as a group, and so we need to figure out what to do here because we can't sustain a living unless we're selling out. I mean, we have to sell out because people stop booking us.
Right.
So it was a real kind of wake-up call, and they voted, and Dennis was put in charge of, and he too was in favor. They were all in favor. They all voted in favor to change the course of their careers. How do we do it? And they said, why don't we talk to Jim Gershow? So Dennis was, I don't know if the right word is tasked, because Jim Gershow told me this himself. I'm paraphrasing, but so what happened was Dennis went up to Caribou and sat with Jim and said, Jim, we're concerned and we need your help. And he said, well, first thing I need to do is come and see you guys perform a show. And he went to a couple shows and he said, okay, well, the first thing you got to do is change what you're doing. You got to play your hits. You got to play all your hit songs. And then within a year's time, Endless Summer had come out, the 2-record set, which went gold.
Right.
So the next thing you know, they were again back on stage performing the hits, which came again through all of them. This was a Carl, Mike, Dennis, Al, and Brian decision. And Dennis agreed he'd go up, talk to Jim Gershow. Jim Gershow came to the shows. And so within a year, you also not just had the success of Endless Summer, you also had the Beach Boys opening for Chicago, because Chicago was huge by 75. And when you talk to the members of Chicago, which I have, they will tell you they didn't want to go on after the Beach Boys, because
Right.
the Beach Boys were like wearing people out. Like the stands would be going up and down. It was just so raucous and alive, and people were needing that again. So you went from, within a year's time, you went from Mount Vernon and Fairway,
Wow.
a fairy tale, to the hits again. And so it was not I think nowadays people are so misinformed. They go, oh, because Mike is the one going out there and doing it, he was the one responsible for that change. They were all responsible for that change. And that change filled up seats and put them back in the spotlight and made them popular again so they could go on to record other albums. It wasn't rocket science. It was just as simple as, how do we put something on stage for the fans that we know is going to be satisfying to them for having spent their hard-earned money to come and see us.
You like everything?
And we've talked about this before, but in the early 1970s, there was this kind of nostalgia zeitgeist in the air. It was the hangover from the 60s. People at this point, were getting tired of heavy music and wanted to harken back to a more innocent time. You had movies like Grease. And, well, speaking of movies, I mean, American Graffiti kicked the whole thing off.
It did. And there's a lot of things you could look at across the platform. I think American Graffiti had a tremendous amount to do with it. That spurred Happy Days. That, each thing slowly but surely touched something else that had to do with something else. Sha-na-na was suddenly on TV.
Yes, that's right, yeah.
So doo-wop was coming back. Doo-wop had kind of disappeared because Jan and Dean were a doo-wop duo, and then, this is the great irony of it all, the Beach Boys started forming, and they were like, well, Dennis says, you guys ought to write a song about surfing, and the Beach Boys are listening to the radio, and they hear Jan and Dean doing Clementine and Baby Talk and Jenny Lee, and they're going, well, we can do bumps like that. And that's exactly what they did for surfing.
Released in November 1961, and the song that started it all for the Beach Boys,
Yeah.
Surfin'.
Thanks, I think, in great part to Dennis, who was this wild, carefree guy who, ran out and got into trouble, drove fast cars, loved the girls. So I think Dennis was kind of more like the brotherly example that Brian probably wished he was. I don't think that's a stretch. And
No,
so
not at all.
I'm sure on some levels, Mike probably even, at that time in his life, probably even envied Dennis, because Mike, I think, by that time had married.
Yes.
And Dennis was still sowing his wild oats.
Yeah, Dennis he is like the ultimate Beach Boy. I mean, when you
Yes.
think about those songs and that kind of lifestyle, fun, surfing USA, I mean, Mike's writing lyrics to these songs and Brian's writing the music, but Dennis is actually going out there and doing it.
And living it.
Yeah,
That's
he's
right,
living it, yeah.
Living it. They're literally living it. But what Dennis knew is Dennis knew that his brother and his cousin were working on music, so it was an easy thing for Dennis to say to them, you ought to just write a song about surfing. You've been down to the beach with me. Because you just think about this. It's not hard to imagine. If you lived in that era and you went down to the beach, the Pacific Coast, in L.A., or down at Huntington or wherever, and you were there at that time, it must have just been so, you think about the music coming on the radio.
Oh,
think
yeah.
about what the life would have been like down there. I mean, it must have been pulsating with an energy that we'll probably never know. And surf culture and having a car and having boards in the back of your car so that you could go down, and just that culture that Brian, thank goodness for Dennis suggesting, thank goodness for Brian for being that introvert who stayed at home and had noodled on the piano as long as he did to get it. And to have those influences of the four freshmen to to be more concerned with the vocal arrangement aspect, to develop pop music in a way that nobody else was doing. Because that, you could say is all accidental, but I mean, my God, what came to pass?
Yeah.
And in today's society, I really want to have this message for new fans of the Beach Boys. People who are just discovering the group for the first time. Is these guys, what they did when they started out, not a mistake. You know, this stuff shaped American music. And just think about that statement. That statement. They shaped American music. And Brian, as I love this quote from Terry Melcher in the Endless Harmony documentary, Brian changed the industry.
The Beach Boys with God Only Knows, and that's going out from Karen to her husband, who may, in fact, be listening to this show for the very first time today. We've been talking with editor of Endless Summer Quarterly magazine, David Beard. And David, what's coming up in the next issue of ESQ? And is there some information about maybe a forthcoming box set celebrating a 50th anniversary of some stuff?
Well, I can't. I'm not at. How do I say this? I'm not at liberty, and I'm also not at. I can tell you what ESQ is doing.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, what's ESQ doing? Okay.
I'm hopeful, just like all the fans out there, that there's going to be something to accompany the coverage that we're doing.
Right.
And all things point to that being the case. So I continue to be hopeful in that regard. So yeah, I've already conducted interviews with Brian and Mike about Sunflower, and I have my questions out to Bruce, and I'm working on my questions for Al, and should be pretty fascinating, I think, because I'm spending. I've had Sunflower sessions for a while, and so listening to them and knowing how much, as one example, knowing how much time that Bruce took on the coda of Tears in the Morning was fascinating to me. Over 40 takes. It's interesting because there's a lot of music recorded. So that's what I'm hoping this box set that I'm hoping will materialize will show us. Because there's a lot of interesting music.
Well, we did get that. We got that EP, that digital EP.
3 songs. That aren't even songs, really. They're pieces of unfinished work, kind of.
So usually it's like a feast at the end of the year with these digital releases, and this year it was a famine. Happy to get the 3 songs, but that would lead me to believe that something is in the works for. And listen,
Murray Wilson and Snow.
Well, okay, there's that too. But when we discuss this, I have a feeling that we're going to have to break that up into two episodes. Okay. Sunflower, because it's that important a record. So.
Yeah. So I will say the last thing about the new ESQ is. John Canis, who was a dear friend of Nick Walusko's, became aware of the winter 2019 edition on the tail end of it, and had contacted me. I contacted him because I saw some photos he had posted on Facebook, and I said, would it be okay to use these photos? I like these pictures. He said, I didn't take them, but you can use them. And the next thing I know, we're talking back and forth, and he said, I really wish I could have gotten something in. And I said, well, I've already filled this edition up, but I've got questions about Nick out to Brian, and John wrote a 10,000 word piece. So it's kind of a first part to the last edition. And then you get the winter 2019 one, and that serves more as part 2, going up to present day, and the relationships and friendships that Gary Griffin and Paul Von Mertens and Probin Gregory and Scott Bennett and Nelson Bragg and all those guys, Jeffrey Foskett, all had with Nick. So it comes up more present day. But it just turned into a really beautiful piece. And if anybody's gone to see Brian since 1998 or 1999, then you know who Nick Walusko is. You may not know him by name, but he was there. And he was the guy who played the song Pet Sounds. Just beautifully. Just a phenomenal talent, and he's greatly missed. And so, if you want to just know a little bit more about Nick, you can head over to, and this is where we're going to go next anyways. Just head over to esquarterly.com, and you can read about just about anything, because there's a blog there, which is in the news section. Just click on the news tab. That'll show you what's going on. A lot of stuff these days, because it's easy for me to just post and write and put stories up in between editions. And so I had five questions. You know how Brian is. He's very quick with answers, very short with answers.
Right.
Brief, to the point. So I had 5 leftovers that I just put up online exclusively. They're up. I put them up on March 7th, my birthday, and, of course, the anniversary of the release of Brian's only solo single with the Beach Boys, Caroline No. So I have kind of a 5-question one with Mike. And also, I want to just tell your listeners, if they subscribe to the magazine, they automatically become eligible to, and normally when I do a giveaway, I use, what's it called, something.org, random.org, which is we just plug in the number of subscribers we have. I click the thing, and then whatever number comes up is the winner.
Right.
And what I'm doing this time is I posted the giveaway, which is the Beach Boys all signed, Brian, Mike, Al, and Bruce signed the Royal Philharmonic with the Beach Boys album from 2018 to the Black Album version, the 2 LP set. And I've got that. It's going to be a giveaway to a subscriber. And all you have to do is be a subscriber and leave comments down on that post at the bottom of the page, and we're going to select our favorite answers. That's the winner gets the autographed LP. The second runner-up gets a still-sealed orange vinyl collectible copy of the album. And so I thought that would be so much more fun to give the fans an opportunity to enter themselves and be a part of the discussion, and as opposed to just picking a random number. But if they go out now, they do have to be. It's the only caveat to win these items is you do have to subscribe to the magazine. If you don't want to, that's okay. You can always read our free content online. But we welcome fans and hope that they enjoy, and they can even order back issues by just clicking the ESQ store button. We started in 93, so there's lots to look at. And they can do a search on any particular member's names, and those editions will come up too. So it's an easy thing. You want to get editions on Al, you want to get editions on Carl, Mike, Bruce, Dennis, you name it. It's Brian, of course. It's all there.
It's all there. David, thanks so much. And we look forward to speaking again when we delve into the Sunflower album. I'm not kidding. That probably will be multiple conversations, because that's a big record with a lot of stuff on it.
It is. I look forward to it.